The revolving glass doors of Meridian Financial Bank turned slowly as Kayla Anderson, a bright-eyed 13-year-old, stepped into the towering marble lobby. Her sneakers squeaked softly on the polished floor, her favorite green hoodie zipped up halfway, and her braids neatly tied with blue bands. To most, she looked like just another teenager, unremarkable, unnoticed. But today was no ordinary day for Kayla. In her small hands, she clutched a thick envelope containing $5,000, a collection of math competition winnings, birthday checks from family, and a generous academic scholarship for gifted students. She had been saving diligently for over a year. This wasn't just pocket money. To Kayla, this envelope symbolized her first real step toward financial independence, something her father had always told her was the foundation of real success. Her father, Charles Anderson, wasn't just any father. He was the chairman and CEO of Meridian Financial Bank, a man known in the financial world for his integrity, wisdom, and calm authority. But Kayla didn't want special treatment. She didn't want the red carpet rolled out just because she was the boss's daughter. She came here today dressed simply, on purpose, no designer handbag, no sparkling jewelry. Just a determined young girl ready to open a savings account and make her first deposit. She had rehearsed this moment many times in her head. She knew the steps. Walk up to the counter. Say clearly, "I'd like to deposit this into my savings account." Hand over the ID. Smile. Walk out with her receipt. She even imagined what she might use the money for: a summer coding camp, a trip to MIT, or maybe even investing in her own mobile app someday. The bank's lobby, with its soaring ceilings and glimmering chandeliers, was filled with the hum of business. Wealthy clients in tailored suits were greeted by name and whisked away to private lounges. Uniformed tellers moved briskly behind bulletproof glass, tapping keys and sliding cash trays. Kayla took a number and quietly joined the line, the envelope pressed tightly against her chest. She wasn't nervous, not yet. In fact, she was proud. Her father had always said, being financially responsible isn't about how much you have, it's about how wisely you manage it. She had taken that to heart. Kayla wanted to earn this moment on her own terms. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that behind those smiling counters and polished professionalism, something ugly was waiting. And in the next hour, what should have been a simple transaction would turn into a defining moment, not just for her, but for the entire institution her father built. As Kayla Anderson stood quietly in line, her eyes drifted across the grand lobby of Meridian Financial Bank. Though only 13, she had always been observant, a natural at identifying patterns and details, thanks to her love for math and logic puzzles. At first, she was just passing the time, watching customers come and go. But the longer she waited, the more she noticed something troubling. A middle-aged white man, probably in his mid-50s, strode through the front door in a sharp navy blue suit, leather briefcase swinging by his side. Almost immediately, a well-dressed employee greeted him at the entrance. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson," the man said, giving a small respectful bow. "Your usual private room is ready. Right this way." Without waiting, the man was escorted past the line, into a side hallway with frosted glass doors, the VIP rooms, Kayla had heard them called. No one in line complained. It was as if everyone had silently agreed that some customers simply deserved better treatment. Next came an elderly Asian couple, holding hands and wearing modest clothing, the kind of pair you'd see sharing pancakes at a local diner on Sunday mornings. They approached the front desk together, but there were no greetings, no smiles. The teller merely nodded toward the seats. "Please wait to be called," the teller said curtly, without even making eye contact. The couple exchanged a confused glance but said nothing. They shuffled to the waiting area and sat down quietly. Then, a Hispanic man, maybe in his 30s, walked in wearing worn jeans and a high-visibility vest, probably a construction worker just off a shift. He carried a folded check in one hand. Kayla saw him walk up to the counter with a hopeful smile. But instead of a smooth transaction, the teller started bombarding him with questions. Do you have a valid photo ID? Where's your social security card? Do you have proof of employment? The man hesitated, fumbling with his wallet. Behind him, a young white woman wearing yoga pants and a Starbucks cup in hand casually stepped up to another window. She deposited a check with barely a glance from the teller, no questions, no delays. Kayla's heart sank. It was subtle, but it was clear, not all customers were being treated the same. It wasn't about the money. It was about how they looked, how they dressed, what assumptions the staff made the moment someone stepped through the doors. She looked down at herself, green hoodie, sneakers, 2 braids, and for the first time, she felt nervous. Would they treat her the same way they did that man in the vest? She glanced back at the envelope in her hand. $5,000. Her money. Earned. Saved. But suddenly, she wasn't sure if that would be enough to earn her respect here. After nearly 40 minutes of waiting, Kayla Anderson's number was finally called. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and approached the counter, envelope in hand. Her heart beat steadily, not from fear, but from anticipation. She had earned this moment. It wasn't just a deposit. It was a milestone. Across from her sat a young teller with a tidy ponytail and a stiff smile. Her nameplate read Emily Carter. Emily glanced up, and for a fleeting second, her expression remained neutral. But as soon as she caught sight of the thick envelope in Kayla's hand, something in her eyes shifted, her smile faded, her brows furrowed ever so slightly. I'd like to deposit this into my savings account, please, Kayla said, her voice clear and polite. Emily took the envelope and cautiously opened it. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the neat stack of cash inside. $5,000 in crisp $100 bills, organized and paper-banded. Instead of proceeding with the transaction, she looked back at Kayla, not with courtesy, but with suspicion. Where did this money come from? She asked flatly. Kayla blinked. The question caught her off guard. From a math scholarship and birthday gifts, she said, still maintaining her composure. Emily didn't respond right away. She simply stared, then turned toward the neighboring workstation. Hey, Jason, she called, her voice tight. Can you take a look at this? A tall man in his early 30s, Jason Miller, as his badge read, walked over. His demeanor was confident, almost smug. He glanced at the cash, then at Kayla, giving her a quick up and down look, lingering on her hoodie and sneakers. This amount seems a bit high for someone your age, Jason said, folding his arms. You sure this is your money? Kayla's hands clenched slightly. Yes, she replied. It's mine. I have a savings account here. Jason leaned in a little, lowering his voice just enough to sound condescending. You know, sometimes people send others to deposit money for them, especially when they don't want to draw attention. Emily said nothing, but the way she looked at Kayla, now with clear distrust, said more than words could. For the first time in her young life, Kayla felt the sting of being treated like a suspect rather than a customer. Not because of anything she had done, but because of how she looked. She had been taught to carry herself with pride, to believe in merit and honesty. But none of that seemed to matter here. Still, she didn't back down. I told you, it's scholarship money and birthday gifts. "I've earned every dollar," she said, her voice firm. But Jason just smirked and whispered something to Emily, loud enough for Kayla to hear. "Could be dirty money. Look at her. Someone's probably pulling the strings." The words landed like a slap. The air around Kayla thickened. She wasn't just being doubted, she was being judged. And the worst part? This was just the beginning. Kayla Anderson stood at the teller's counter, her back straight, her voice unwavering, but inside, her stomach churned. Jason Miller's snide remark echoed in her ears, "Could be dirty money." A bank employee had just accused her, indirectly but unmistakably, of being involved in something criminal. And all because she dared to deposit her own money while wearing sneakers and a hoodie. "I've already told you," Kayla said, slower this time. "This money is mine. I earned it. I have a savings account here." Jason chuckled under his breath, then turned toward Emily Carter, the teller. "Let's flag this. We may have a money laundering case," he said, not even pretending to whisper. The words sliced through the air like broken glass. A few customers nearby paused. Some turned their heads to look. One elderly woman squinted, clearly confused. A middle-aged man in a navy windbreaker took a step back, pulling his wife gently by the elbow. Everyone seemed unsure whether to intervene or avoid involvement altogether. Kayla swallowed the lump rising in her throat. She had kept calm until now, just as her father had always taught her, "Hold your head high. Let your words carry your truth." But this was more than a misunderstanding. It was public humiliation. Then, a new voice entered the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" Susan Whitmore, the branch manager, stepped forward. A woman in her early 40s with carefully styled blonde hair and a blazer that practically screamed authority, Susan carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. Emily quickly briefed her, tilting her head slightly toward Kayla, and Susan's gaze immediately shifted to the girl. She gave Kayla the kind of once-over that didn't need words, a slow, calculated scan from head to toe, as if determining whether she belonged here at all. "Sweetheart," Susan began, her voice sweet like syrup, but with no real warmth, "this kind of money doesn't usually come from allowances." Kayla's lips parted slightly. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Susan wasn't asking, she was telling her that she didn't believe her. "I just want to deposit my money," Kayla said again. "Why is that so hard to understand?" Susan leaned slightly over the counter, her voice low and condescending. "Maybe you'd feel more comfortable at one of those places that specialize in cash deposits, the kind of place people like you usually go to." That did it. Kayla's breath caught, not from fear but from fire. Her fingers, resting on the edge of the counter, tightened slightly. The phrase "people like you" had been used before, at school, in stores, in whispers. But never this blatantly. She had held it in long enough. Calmly, she reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out her phone. "I think it's time you speak to my father," she said, unlocking the screen. "His name is Charles Anderson." The shift in energy was immediate. Jason blinked. Emily froze. Susan narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me," she said, but the sarcasm had already begun to falter. Kayla didn't respond. She tapped her father's name in her contacts and held the phone to her ear. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice came through. "Kayla, sweetheart, are you at the bank already?" Charles Anderson's voice was calm, deep, and unmistakable. Kayla met Susan's gaze directly. "Yes, Dad. I'm at the main branch. They won't let me deposit my money, and now they're saying I look suspicious." The silence in the room was deafening. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Susan's hand trembled slightly at her side. Jason stepped back. Emily's face turned pale. Kayla slowly extended the phone toward Susan. "My dad would like a word with the person in charge." The moment Kayla Anderson held out her phone to Susan Whitmore, the branch manager's face stiffened. Her hand hovered midair as if deciding whether to accept the call or walk away. The name Charles Anderson, chairman of Meridian Financial Bank, rang in her ears like a church bell at midnight, loud, clear, and impossible to ignore. She took the phone with hesitation. "This is Susan Whitmore," she said, her voice strained but trying to remain composed. What followed was silence, then a single sentence from the other end of the line that made her knees weaken. "You have 3 minutes to explain why my daughter was just treated like a criminal in my own bank." Susan swallowed hard. Behind the counter, Jason Miller and Emily Carter stood motionless. Neither of them dared to look at Kayla. The lobby, which just minutes earlier had been filled with movement and murmurs, now felt frozen. Customers pretended not to listen, but their ears were tuned in like radios at full volume. By the time the call ended, Susan's expression had shifted entirely. Her professional smile had vanished. The authority in her posture deflated like a tire gone flat. And then, only 20 minutes later, the glass doors of the branch flew open. In walked Charles Anderson, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, his black leather shoes echoing with each determined step across the marble floor. Behind him followed Linda Hayes, the bank's chief operating officer, along with 2 other board members. The employees who saw them instantly stood straighter. Even the security guard near the front entrance reflexively stepped aside. But Charles didn't pause. He walked straight to the counter where Kayla stood, gently placed a hand on her shoulder, and looked into her eyes, not to ask what happened, but to assure her, "I've got this now." Then, turning to Susan, his voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. It was the kind of voice that cut clean with calm precision. "You just insulted my daughter. You judged her. You humiliated her in front of strangers. And you didn't do it because of a transaction, you did it because of how she looked." Susan's mouth opened, searching for a defense, but Charles wasn't finished. "You didn't follow policy. You didn't check the account. You didn't treat her like a customer. And this bank, my bank, was built to serve all people fairly." Jason tried to step in, hoping to explain, but Charles turned to him next. "You too. You thought a young black girl couldn't have $5,000 unless it was suspicious. You made assumptions, whispered slurs under your breath. And it's all on record." At that, Linda Hayes lifted a sleek black tablet, tapping the screen to show surveillance footage captured from earlier that day. It played clips of the exact interaction, Jason scoffing, Susan's dismissive tone, and Emily's silence. No one spoke. The guilt in their eyes said everything. Finally, Charles took a deep breath. His voice now was low, almost somber. "You've not only failed as professionals, you've failed as human beings." Then, with a final glance at Susan, Jason, and Emily, he delivered the sentence. "You're fired. Effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the bank. A few customers even nodded quietly. The storm had arrived, not loud or wild, but swift, exact, and with purpose. And at the center of it all stood Kayla, not as a victim, but as a symbol of dignity. Back at Meridian Financial's headquarters, a room full of executives sat in stunned silence. Just moments ago, they had watched live security footage of their chairman, Charles Anderson, firing 3 bank employees on the spot. But that wasn't what left them speechless. What struck them deeper was the truth now impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about Kayla. A young IT technician, barely out of college, sat trembling in front of a large monitor. He had been asked to review the day's footage from the bank's surveillance system. What he found made his stomach turn. I think we have a bigger problem," he said, his voice tight. The head of security, a graying man with 30 years in law enforcement, turned to him. "What do you mean, bigger?" The technician played back clips from earlier that same morning. A white businessman in an Armani suit greeted at the door, ushered past the line. An elderly Asian couple waved off with a dismissive hand. A Hispanic laborer questioned for 5 minutes about his ID just to cash a small check. A black woman left standing at the counter for over 30 minutes without acknowledgement. One by one, the pattern unfolded: privilege for some, scrutiny for others, based almost entirely on race, clothing, and perceived social class. The boardroom fell silent again. It wasn't just one rogue employee. It wasn't just one bad manager. This was a systemic failure. Charles Anderson stood at the center of the room, arms folded tightly, jaw clenched. He had spent years building this bank with a vision of equal access and community trust. Now that vision lay cracked beneath a mountain of uncomfortable truths. "This is not who we say we are," he finally said, his voice quiet but fierce. "And it's not who we can continue to be." Around the table, heads slowly nodded. Eyes looked down, not out of shame alone, but in recognition. Something had to change, not tomorrow, not next quarter, but now. Charles turned to Linda Hayes, his COO. "Start drafting new protocols. Full restructuring. Top to bottom." She didn't hesitate. "We'll begin with mandatory anti-discrimination training. Then we'll implement transaction monitoring by race and demographic. Every interaction. Every branch." "And consequences?" asked another board member. Charles looked him dead in the eye. "Real ones. From today forward, fairness isn't a slogan. It's policy." What started as a humiliating moment for a 13-year-old girl had become the spark that set fire to a broken culture, one long overdue for reform. And Charles Anderson wasn't just fixing a branch anymore. He was about to rebuild the soul of his bank. 2 weeks had passed since the storm at Meridian Financial Bank. Public apologies had been issued. Reforms were underway. Training sessions were being held in every branch from coast to coast. And in boardrooms, words like transparency, equity, and accountability were finally being treated not as corporate jargon, but as real commitments. But for Kayla Anderson, none of that mattered unless the change could be felt on the ground, by everyday people. One cool Monday morning, she decided to find out for herself. She didn't tell her father. She didn't bring security or cameras. She simply pulled on an old gray hoodie, a faded pair of jeans, and her most worn-out sneakers. She tucked her braids under a baseball cap and walked alone through the revolving doors of the same branch where everything had unfolded. This time, she carried a check, not cash, for $10,000, a scholarship extension and speaking honorarium she had recently received from an education nonprofit. The lobby looked the same: clean marble floors, quiet background music, polite voices floating through the air. But something felt different. Subtle. Quieter. The receptionist smiled at her. "Good morning, welcome to Meridian. Are you here to make a deposit or need account help?" "Deposit," Kayla answered softly. "Right this way," the woman said warmly. "No wait today. We'll get you taken care of." Kayla stepped up to the teller window. Her heart paused for a moment when she saw the familiar face of Emily Carter, the same young woman who had once doubted her. But this time, Emily's demeanor was different. She smiled gently. "Hello there. How can I help you today?" Kayla slid the check across the counter. "I'd like to deposit this into my savings account." Emily looked it over, pulled up the account, and nodded. "Everything looks great. Deposit will be available by tomorrow morning. Would you like a receipt?" "That's it?" Kayla asked, her voice cautious. Emily blinked, then smiled again. "Yes, that's it. No questions about the money source. No sideways glances. No condescending whispers to a supervisor. Just a simple transaction, the kind every American should expect from their bank." As Kayla stepped away from the counter, she glanced back and saw something even more meaningful. An elderly black man being greeted with respect at another window. A Latina single mom being guided through the account opening process by a friendly staff member. A young Asian couple filling out forms together at a consultation desk, with coffee and a welcoming smile from the banker. The bank hadn't just changed policies. It had changed its people. And that, Kayla thought, was the first step toward something lasting. She walked out without fanfare, no cameras, no headlines, just a quiet confidence in her stride. For the first time, she didn't leave feeling judged. She left feeling seen. It started with a quiet act, a 13-year-old girl walking into a bank to deposit her own hard-earned money. It became a national conversation. And now, just a few months later, Kayla Anderson stood at the front of a crowded auditorium at Meridian Financial's national headquarters, a podium before her, hundreds of eyes watching. Behind her hung a large banner with 5 simple words. "Every customer deserves equal respect." To Kayla, it wasn't just a slogan. It was a promise, one the bank had nearly broken, but one she was determined to rebuild. Beside her stood her father, Charles Anderson, the man who had taught her the value of honesty, independence, and never staying silent in the face of injustice. Today, however, the spotlight wasn't on him. It was on her. Kayla had been invited to join the newly established Financial Fairness Council, a groundbreaking initiative aimed at creating policies to eliminate bias in banking. The council included economists, community leaders, educators, and, at Charles's request, at least one voice that represented the next generation. That voice was Kayla's. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice calm but clear. "When I walked into that bank a few months ago, I didn't expect to change anything. I didn't come to prove a point. I just wanted to make a deposit. That's it." The room was silent. But the way I was treated, with suspicion, judgment, and disrespect, wasn't just wrong. It was common. It happens every day to people who don't look or dress a certain way. And for far too long, it was ignored. She paused, taking in the faces of executives, staff, and even customers who had once filed complaints of their own. This council isn't about pointing fingers. It's about fixing what's broken. It's about making sure that when someone walks through the doors of a bank, whether they have $10 or $10,000, they are treated with dignity. No assumptions. No discrimination. Just service. The room broke into applause. Not the polite kind, but heartfelt, rising to a standing ovation. As Kayla stepped down, Linda Hayes, now the newly appointed president of operations, smiled at her. "You didn't just change a branch, Kayla. You changed the whole industry." In the weeks that followed, banks across the country began examining their own policies. Some reached out to Charles for guidance. Others invited Kayla to speak. Her story was even taught in classrooms as part of a civics and ethics unit. But to Kayla, the real victory wasn't in headlines or awards. It was in seeing an elderly woman finally greeted with warmth, or a young man in work boots helped without judgment. She hadn't just created change. She had created a movement. And she wasn't done yet. The story of Kayla Anderson reminds us that no matter how far society progresses, the fight for dignity and fairness is never truly finished. For many of us who have seen decades of change, through civil rights movements, economic shifts, and cultural reckonings, this story strikes a familiar chord. It reminds us of the work still left to do. One of the most profound lessons here is that prejudice often hides in everyday places, sometimes in systems we think are neutral, like banks, schools, or hospitals. But as this story shows, bias can show itself not through loud declarations, but through silent assumptions, cold glances, or unequal treatment. Yet it also teaches us that one voice can spark meaningful reform. Kayla, a 13-year-old girl, didn't shout or storm out. She stood her ground. She spoke the truth with calm clarity, and that courage exposed an injustice far bigger than herself. Her actions led to systemic change, not just in one branch, but across an entire institution. For those of us later in life, it's a reminder that our values must be passed on, not just spoken, but lived out. Whether as parents, mentors, or leaders, we are called to foster a culture where fairness isn't optional, and silence in the face of injustice isn't acceptable. In the end, Kayla didn't just change a policy. She reminded a generation, and perhaps the next one, that doing the right thing still matters, and it always will.